Hey, class. In this part of the lecture, and I'm getting to the end of this week, we're moving into Mexican Texas. So, if I were you, uh, what I would do is I would indicate somewhere on your notes that we have moved out of the Spanish period and into the Mexican period of Texas history. The dividing line is 1821. I know students hate dates and it kills history, but some dates you just have to know. And 1821 is one of those dates. That's when the Spanish are run out of North America and Mexico becomes an independent republic, including Spanish Texas becomes Mexican Texas in 1821. What we're also shading into, and just as importantly, is the period in which Anglo-Americans are bringing their enslaved workers into Texas as well in large numbers. It just so happened that these things happened almost simultaneously. There's not a big conspiracy here. There wasn't a game plan. It's just the way that history works in this particular case. So what you want to make note of is that number one, we're into Mexican Texas, but also, and just as importantly, we're into a period where Anglos now are dominating Texas. They've come into Texas. Many have brought in there and enslaved with them. And what's happening is Texas is moving into, because of the entry of Anglo-Americans and their African-American captives, economically, Texas is moving into the era when it's becoming part of the global cotton economy. Okay. So up until this point in the course, Texas has really been the economy of Texas, such as it was really a ranching economy, and I've talked about that, and that was about it, and that was it was subsistence. Some families gained a lot of wealth in ranching, but nothing compared to cotton. Cotton was the dominant commodity of this part of the 19th century, all the way up until the Civil War and even after the Civil War. As late as the 1930s, about 100 years ago, one out of three Texans worked in some form or fashion in cotton, either picking cotton or producing cotton. So for 100 years, cotton is going to be the dominant economy in Texas. Ranching doesn't go away, of course. It's just not as important as cotton. So tied to cotton, and I've alluded to this, but let me make it explicit. What we're also seeing beginning during the early 1820s, when Texas now becomes Mexican territory, we're seeing the entry of slavery into Texas. There had been just a handful of slaves in Texas before 1821. But when Anglos come into Texas, they bring in their enslaved with them. Most Anglos that come into Texas in the 1820s want to grow cotton. They want to use the fertile soil of East Texas to grow cotton. They want to sell this cotton either to European powers such as England and France, or they wanted to sell it to the U.S. Northeast. But cotton was the big moneymaker. Cotton, cotton, cotton. I can't say it enough. And the other thing I can't say enough is that what is tied to cotton production is slavery. So one of the ways you might want to put this in your notes is cotton equals slavery and slavery equal cotton. Because Anglos coming into Texas, most all Anglos coming into Texas, what they believed, and I'm not defending them I'm not defending them, I'm just trying to explain this to you. They believed that cotton cultivation had to be done by the enslaved African Americans that they bring with them. So not only are we moving into the Mexican period of Texas history, we're also at the same time, because of the opening of the door to Texas, we are also moving into the Anglo period of Texas history, the cotton period of Texas history, and tied to that very closely is the period in Texas history when we start to see large numbers of African Americans coming into Texas, mostly as enslaved workers. Okay, so that's kind of a big picture of where we're at now. We've left the Spanish period. You might notice in the Spanish period, I didn't talk about slavery much because it wasn't a big deal during the Spanish period, but it's going to become a very, very big deal in Texas after 1821. Now, the other point I want to make is what Mexico inherits in Texas in 1821 is a big mess. I've talked about this at length. Texas is depopulated. Maybe there's only 4,000 Tejanos in the entire province of Spanish Texas, now Mexican Texas. Certainly, the war against Spain, especially the Texas's role in the war against Spain, and how the Spanish crushed the Mexican Revolution in Texas, that helps depopulate Texas. So really very, very few Tejanos in Texas in 1821. Very, very quickly, Tejanos will be outnumbered by Anglo-Americans and even slaves. So it's a mess. For instance, there's a major flood in San Antonio in 1819. If you ever walk along the river walk, it's very peaceful, but that's because the river walk, one of the things it does, it serves to stop the San Antonio River from flooding, which it did about every 10 years or so. San Antonio was flooded during the very last years of Spanish rule. And so Texas basically by 1821 is a depopulated mess with only 3 communities: San Antonio, by far the most dominant one, Nacogdoches in East Texas, and Goliad, southeast of San Antonio, near what becomes Victoria. The other thing that's happened is the Comanche, who we've talked about, by the 1820s, they've started to go crazy again. What the Comanche are doing is they've made contact with the hundreds of thousands of Americans who live in Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, very, very quickly growing areas at a time when Spanish Texas in 1821 was only 4,000 Tejanos. The states to the east, the U.S. states to the east of Spanish and then Mexican Texas, number, I think, over 400,000. I mean, Texas, there's no comparison in terms of the population. And you can see now, why Texas is going to come into the U.S. orbit in 25 years. And what I'll do in over the next couple of weeks is talk about that process. So one of the things is the Comanche now, they see a market in Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama. And what they have is they trade hides, buffalo hides, of course, but they also start stealing huge numbers of horses from the Spanish and then the Mexicans as well. And there's very little that Spanish and Mexican authorities can do. I hope one of the things that you're taking from this course is that the story of the Comanche in the Spanish period and the Mexican period, the indigenous tribes, they're the big winners here, not the Europeans, not the Spanish and not the Mexicans. And in fact, the Anglos aren't able to defeat the Comanche until the mid 1870s. So the Comanches can more than hold their own and have during this period. And so from the Spanish, now Mexican point of view, the Comanche are becoming a major headache again. And this does explain one of the reasons that the Spanish, then the Mexicans, opened the door to Texas, to Anglo settlers. I talked about previously in this podcast how Spanish, then Mexican authorities hoped that the Anglo settlers that Stephen F. Austin and the other impresarios brought into Texas, that they would become first, good Spanish citizens, and of course, after 1821, good Mexican citizens. Doesn't happen, as we know. But one of the reasons that the Spanish, then Mexicans, are opening the door to Anglos is they need help with the Comanche. They just can't do it on their own. So I've said this, but this is, I'm a big believer in repetition, and it may drive you crazy, but it's a feature, not a bug of my teaching. Anyway, so the Spanish, later Mexicans, don't have many cards to play. And so in the last desperate attempt to populate Texas, the doors are open to the Americans, the Anglo-Americans, who are also bringing in their enslaved. And Texas history will become much more dynamic in many respects than it's been so far, because Texas now becomes part of the cotton global economy. Texas cotton is going to England very early and to the Northeast. So suddenly now there's wealth in Texas in a way that there had never been before. And of course, this cotton is grown mostly in East Texas. You can't grow cotton in San Antonio without irrigation because there's not enough water here. But you can grow cotton to about, I would say, LaGrange, maybe Columbus. West of there, it becomes a little shaky because there's not enough rain. So Texas but there's a lot of land in Texas between the Gulf of Mexico and, say, the LaGrange, Columbus area. So Texas now in the 1820s, besides becoming Mexican, is at the same time becoming Anglo with African American presence. And it's also becoming, and this is tied very tightly to the Anglo immigration, it's also becoming part of the cotton global economy. So Texas has moved in the 1820s and in this course into a very, very different era.